The road that brought them here narrowed into a ribbon of frozen mud and broken stone, winding between low hills that offered neither shelter nor command. It was late in the war, though no one said that aloud, because late did not mean safe, and it did not mean finished. Snow fell without urgency, a thin, persistent veil that softened the edges of the world while making every sound sharper. Engines were cut before dawn, and the sudden quiet felt heavier than the cold. Men pulled their coats tighter and waited for orders that had already been given, orders that now felt incomplete. The position was meant to be temporary. According to the maps folded and refolded in the commander's pocket, this stretch of ground was a hinge between larger movements, a place to observe, to hold lightly, and then to move on. But the maps were weeks old, drawn from aerial photographs taken under clearer skies, before roads collapsed under traffic and villages emptied themselves of anything useful. Intelligence reports suggested only scattered resistance, units retreating in disorder. But intelligence was an echo, never the sound itself. The ground told a different story, and it spoke quietly, through the shape of the hills and the way the wind cut across them. The unit numbered fewer than expected. Losses accumulated not in dramatic bursts, but through frostbite, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of men reassigned and never replaced. Supplies arrived late or not at all, and when they did arrive, they were incomplete. Boxes packed for a different place, a different plan. Ammunition was counted twice. Rations were stretched. Radios worked only when they felt like it, their signals bending and breaking in the cold air. The commander noted these things without comment, because comment did not change reality, and reality was already full. He walked the perimeter as light crept back into the sky, boots crunching softly over frozen ground. Each foxhole was a small, private world of breath and steam, of fingers wrapped around metal that burned with cold. He stopped, listened, nodded, moved on. His calm was not performative. It was a habit formed over years of learning what fear did when given too much space. He knew the doctrine, knew what the manuals said about holding exposed positions, about withdrawal and reinforcement. But doctrine assumed cooperation from weather, terrain, and time. Here, none of those were reliable. The landscape offered long sightlines in theory and blind angles in practice. Low ridges blocked vision just enough to invite surprise, and sparse tree lines gave the illusion of cover without the substance. Snow collected in shallow drifts that could hide movement or betray it, depending on light and angle. The men learned quickly where sound carried, where a careless step would echo, where the wind would mask it. They learned without instruction, because instruction lagged behind necessity. By midday, the sky flattened into a uniform gray, pressing down on the position until it felt smaller than it was. A runner arrived with a message that clarified nothing, a confirmation of a mission already compromised by conditions on the ground. Hold, observe, report. Reinforcements were mentioned, not promised. The commander read the paper once, folded it carefully, and placed it back into his pocket. He did not gather the men for a speech. He did not need to. They understood the situation through the same cues he did. The quiet, the distance from anything familiar, the sense that they were visible without being supported. Time slowed in the afternoon. Men checked weapons they had already checked. Someone brewed coffee, so weak it was more ritual than sustenance. Conversation drifted and faded, replaced by the small noises of a position settling into itself. The cold deepened as the sun dipped behind the hills, and with it came the awareness of vulnerability. Night would erase what little advantage daylight provided, and the radios remained unreliable. The commander weighed options that did not feel like choices, only variations of endurance. As darkness settled, flares went up far off to the east, brief white blossoms against the black. No one spoke. They watched until the light died and the sky closed again. The sound of distant artillery followed, muffled but unmistakable, a reminder that movement continued elsewhere, that this quiet was not peace, but pause. The commander returned to his shelter and studied the map by flashlight, tracing lines that no longer matched the ground. He marked nothing. He memorized instead, committing the reality of the place to mind in case paper failed him. Sleep came in fragments. The cold woke them. The wind worried at loose fabric and canvas. Somewhere beyond the ridges, engines moved, then stopped. Whether they were friendly or not remained unanswered, and unanswered questions carried weight. The commander lay awake longer than he intended, listening, measuring the night by sound and absence. He thought of the men spread thin across the position, of the doctrine that assumed margins he did not have, of the way late-war language encouraged optimism where caution belonged. When dawn returned, it brought no revelation. The snow had stopped, leaving the ground harder, louder. Visibility improved, but only enough to confirm what they already suspected. They were alone in a place that mattered more than expected, with a mission that no longer fit the shape of the war as it was being fought around them. The commander rose, adjusted his coat, and stepped back into the cold, carrying with him the quiet understanding that holding this ground would demand more than orders ever acknowledged. There was no ceremony in that understanding, no sense of destiny, only acceptance shaped by experience. He gathered his officers briefly, spoke plainly, and dismissed them to their tasks. The position remained unchanged, but the weight of it settled deeper, felt in shoulders and breath, in the careful way eyes scanned the horizon, measuring distance, patience, and resolve. Nothing else could be done except stand, endure, and wait together. Morning did not bring relief so much as confirmation. The cold lingered in the ground, locked into the soil and the men's bones, and every movement felt deliberate, as if the world itself resisted change. The position looked the same as it had the day before, but it felt different, subtly altered by information that arrived not all at once, but in fragments. A patrol returned just after first light, their faces tight, eyes alert in a way that came from more than lack of sleep. They reported tracks where none should have been, boot prints partially filled with snow, moving along a shallow defile to the north. No contact, no shots fired, just signs of passage that did not align with the idea of scattered resistance. The commander listened without interruption. He asked precise questions about spacing, direction, depth, the kind that could only be answered by men who had been there. He nodded, dismissed them to warm up, and made a note in the margin of his map that meant nothing to anyone else. Tracks alone did not change orders, but they changed emphasis. Observation posts were adjusted slightly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to close angles that now felt too open. He gave instructions quietly, maintaining the rhythm of routine, because routine was the scaffolding that kept fatigue from becoming panic. As the day progressed, sound became the dominant sense. Far off, beyond the ridges, engines ran longer than before, then cut out. Artillery fired intermittently, not close enough to be immediate, not far enough to be irrelevant. The men learned to distinguish calibers by ear, a skill acquired through repetition rather than training. Each sound suggested movement, coordination, intent, but none provided clarity. Radios crackled with reports from neighboring units that were no longer exactly neighbors, their positions shifting as pressure built elsewhere. Messages were brief, clipped by interference, leaving gaps the mind rushed to fill. The terrain itself seemed to change under scrutiny. Snow melted slightly in the afternoon sun, then refroze, turning paths into slick channels that funneled movement, whether intended or not. A low stand of trees that had appeared insignificant now read as concealment. A shallow depression became an approach route in the commander's mind, its gentle curve offering protection from observation. He walked these features again, seeing them not as static geography, but as invitations and warnings. Planning, he understood, was not about predicting the enemy's actions so much as preparing for the ways they might exploit what was already there. Men grew quieter. Conversation narrowed to essentials, jokes falling flat or not attempted at all. Fatigue showed itself in small ways. A delayed response to a call, a hand lingering too long on a canteen, eyes that took a moment to focus. The commander watched for these signs without comment. He adjusted duty rotations, extending some, shortening others, making decisions that balanced rest against vigilance. There was no formula for it, only judgment informed by experience and a sense of how much strain could be carried before it began to show. By late afternoon, reconnaissance reports multiplied. None confirmed direct contact, but all suggested proximity. Movement in the tree line at dusk, silhouettes that vanished when watched too closely. A glint of metal caught briefly in low light, then nothing. Each report was plausible on its own. Together they formed a pattern that was harder to dismiss. The commander updated his mental picture of the battlefield, expanding the likely size of the opposing force, revising assumptions that had felt reasonable only days earlier. He did this internally, carefully, aware that his outward calm mattered as much as the decisions themselves. Orders from higher command arrived delayed and incomplete, acknowledging increased enemy activity in general terms, while offering no immediate change in mission. Hold, observe, report remained the directive, now complicated by the knowledge that observation alone could invite engagement. The commander read the message twice, then once more, looking for nuance in phrasing that might allow flexibility. He found none. Doctrine lagged reality again, and the gap widened. As darkness fell, the pressure became physical. Flares rose more frequently in the distance, their light reflecting off low clouds and washing the landscape in brief, unnatural brightness. Each flare prompted stillness, weapons angled, breath held. When nothing followed, the men exhaled slowly, resetting for the next interruption. Sleep became even more fragmented, snatched in minutes rather than hours. The cold intensified, and with it the ache in joints and muscles already overworked. The commander convened his officers in low voices, not to announce changes, but to align understanding. He spoke plainly about what they knew and what they did not, about the likelihood that the enemy presence was more organized than previously believed. He did not speculate beyond necessity. Speculation bred distraction, and distraction was a luxury they could not afford. Instead, he emphasized discipline, observation, and the importance of reporting even the smallest anomaly. Pressure without contact, he understood, was still pressure, and it wore men down in ways sudden action did not. Night sounds carried strangely. A branch snapping could be nothing or everything, somewhere close enough to be unsettling. Voices carried briefly on the wind, indistinct, then gone. No one fired. Orders were clear on that point. Fire without confirmation would invite response, and response would reveal positions that had so far remained intact. Restraint required effort equal to action, and the men felt it in the tension of their grips, in the way shoulders hunched against both cold and expectation. By the time another gray dawn approached, the position had not been tested by force, but it had been shaped by presence. The men were more tired than the hours justified, worn by anticipation and the constant recalibration of threat. The commander stood again at the edge of the position, scanning ground he now knew too well, aware that planning had shifted from abstract preparation to immediate adaptation. The enemy had not yet made itself fully known, but its influence was undeniable, pressing inward through sound, movement, and uncertainty. Holding order under those conditions was its own kind of engagement, one that demanded patience, judgment, and a steady hand. The change revealed itself not in a single moment, but in the way familiar options quietly disappeared. Paths that had once offered flexibility now felt watched, their openness an invitation rather than an escape. The commander recognized it during a routine check of the western approach, where a shallow ravine had previously served as a fallback route. New tracks cut across it at angles too deliberate to be incidental, pressed deep into the frozen soil by weight and repetition. They told a story of movement with purpose, not retreat. The realization settled slowly, accompanied by the dull certainty that withdrawal, if ordered, would no longer be simple. Communications faltered further as the day wore on. Radios that had been unreliable became almost silent, their bursts of static punctuated by half-formed messages that arrived stripped of context. Attempts to reach higher command went unanswered or returned distorted acknowledgments that clarified nothing. The commander understood enough about the terrain to know why. Low ground and ridges interfered with signal propagation, and the enemy, now clearly present in force, was likely contributing to the degradation. Silence, intentional or not, had the same effect. It isolated the position, not just physically, but mentally, forcing decisions inward rather than upward. The numerical imbalance emerged through observation rather than reports. A reconnaissance team counted vehicles moving along a distant road, more than could be explained by supply alone. Infantry formations shifted in the tree lines with coordination that suggested fresh units, not remnants. The enemy did not rush. They advanced with patience, occupying ground that mattered while avoiding unnecessary contact. Each move closed space, reduced options, and did so without provoking a response that might slow them. The commander marked these developments mentally, aware that each unopposed maneuver increased the cost of any future action. Among the men, reactions varied, but followed a recognizable arc. Some grew more talkative, filling the quiet with speculation they barely believed themselves. Others withdrew, conserving energy and emotion alike. There were no outbursts, no overt signs of panic, but the strain showed in posture and pace. Helmets sat lower. Eyes tracked movement longer than before. When orders came, they were followed quickly, almost eagerly, because action, even limited, provided relief from waiting. The commander noticed these shifts and adjusted his leadership accordingly, offering clarity where possible and consistency everywhere else. Doctrine offered guidance that now felt conditional. The manuals spoke of holding actions, of delaying maneuvers supported by depth and reserves. Here, depth was measured in meters, reserves in intentions, rather than units. The commander balanced adherence with adaptation, choosing which principles still applied and which required reinterpretation. He reinforced key positions not because doctrine demanded it, but because the terrain did. He conserved ammunition not because of supply tables, but because resupply was no longer a certainty. Each decision rippled outward, affecting confidence as much as capability. As daylight faded, the sense of encirclement sharpened. Enemy movement became visible on multiple axes, not close enough to force engagement, but close enough to deny freedom. The routes that remained open were exposed, requiring daylight and coordination that could not be assumed. Time pressure replaced distance as the dominant constraint. The commander felt it in the way hours compressed, in how quickly conditions changed between checks of the line. Delay no longer favored them. It favored the force that could afford patience. Night brought limited cover and greater danger. Sounds multiplied and overlapped, making it difficult to separate threat from background. Orders emphasized restraint, but restraint grew harder as proximity increased. At one listening post, voices carried clearly enough to identify language, cadence, even fatigue. The men there reported it calmly, professionally, but the effect lingered. The enemy was no longer an abstract presence shaping the battlefield from afar. They were close enough to be human, close enough to make mistakes, close enough to force decisions that Doctrine rarely addressed directly. Leadership took on a different weight under these conditions. The commander moved more frequently among his men, not to reassure with words, but to be seen, to anchor their perception of control. He spoke plainly when he spoke at all, acknowledging difficulty without dramatizing it. Morale did not hinge on optimism. It hinged on trust, on the belief that decisions were made with awareness and intent. He carried the burden of uncertainty deliberately, absorbing it so it did not disperse unchecked through the unit. By the time another dawn approached, the shape of the situation was clear even if its outcome was not. Encirclement was no longer a possibility. It was a process already underway. The enemy had taken ground, denied movement, and strained communication without firing a decisive shot. The unit remained intact, disciplined, and responsive, but it existed now within narrowing limits. The commander reviewed his options once more, aware that each hour reduced flexibility. Doctrine still provided a framework, but it bent under the weight of circumstances it had never fully anticipated. What remained constant was the men themselves, their endurance, and the fragile order maintained in a space that continued to shrink. The moment did not arrive with ceremony. There was no dramatic signal, no single report that forced the issue. Instead, the decision took shape gradually, assembled from hours of observation, fragments of information, and the steady compression of options. By early morning, it was clear that waiting longer would not improve their position. Enemy presence now defined the ground beyond the perimeter, not sporadically but with intent. Routes that remained technically open were functionally denied, watched closely enough that movement would invite immediate response. The commander understood that encirclement was no longer approaching. It was settling in. He withdrew to his shelter briefly, not to escape responsibility, but to focus it. Inside, the air smelled of damp fabric, oil, and cold metal. A dim light illuminated the map spread across a crate, its creases worn soft from constant handling. He studied it without expectation of revelation. The map could not tell him what he needed to know now. It only confirmed what experience already had. Any attempt to break out along standard lines would require speed, coordination, and firepower they did not possess in sufficient measure. The enemy's strength was no longer theoretical. It was present, layered, and patient. Doctrine offered clear responses for encirclement, but those responses assumed parity or relief. Neither applied here. A fighting withdrawal would consume ammunition rapidly and expose wounded men to conditions they could not survive. Holding in place promised eventual destruction, not because of dramatic assault, but through attrition and isolation. Reinforcement remained unlikely. The commander did not resent this reality. He accepted it with the same clarity that had guided him through earlier stages. What troubled him was not the absence of good options, but the consequences attached to each remaining one. Responsibility weighed differently now. Earlier, it had meant maintaining order, discipline, and morale under pressure. Now it meant choosing which risks were justified and which were not. He thought of the men individually, not as a formation, but as faces and habits, as voices heard in the dark. He thought of their endurance so far, of the restraint they had shown when firing would have been easier. Lives were not abstractions to be balanced against objectives. They were commitments already made, obligations he carried whether acknowledged or not. He convened his officers quietly, bringing them together without urgency, but without delay. They gathered close, speaking in low tones, aware that this conversation marked a shift. He laid out the situation plainly, neither minimizing nor exaggerating. He spoke of enemy movement, of communications that could no longer be trusted, of time pressure that favored the other side. He did not ask for consensus, but he listened carefully as they spoke, noting agreement and hesitation alike. Their reactions reflected professionalism rather than surprise. They had felt the same narrowing of space, the same quiet urgency. One option, unconventional and imperfect, remained. It carried risk not defined by manuals or after-action reports. It would require coordination under cover of darkness, acceptance of uncertainty, and the willingness to abandon equipment that Doctrine treated as essential. It would also mean deviating from expected patterns of behavior, trusting judgment over procedure. The commander weighed this option last, not because it was reckless, but because it demanded ownership. If it failed, responsibility would be singular and absolute. He considered the broader context of the war, not in terms of outcome, but of purpose. This position, once marginal, had become symbolically heavy without gaining corresponding strategic value. Holding it at all costs would not alter the larger campaign. Losing the unit here would be noticed only in reports, not in outcomes. Survival, by contrast, preserved experience and cohesion that could matter elsewhere. The calculus was not heroic, but it was honest. When the decision settled, it did so without relief. He felt no sense of triumph or cleverness, only resolve. He issued orders methodically, breaking the plan into phases that emphasized clarity and restraint. Movements would be quiet, deliberate, time to avoid patterns the enemy expected. Non-essential gear would be cached or destroyed. Wounded men would be prioritized without exception. The plan assumed friction and accounted for it where possible. It did not promise safety, only possibility. The reaction among the men was subdued. There were questions, but few objections. Surprise registered briefly, then gave way to understanding. They trusted the commander not because the order sounded bold, but because it sounded considered. Action replaced waiting, and with it came a shift in energy. Preparation took on a different texture, focused and purposeful. Fear did not vanish, but it aligned itself with movement rather than paralysis. As darkness fell, the position they had held for days began to empty in fragments. Small groups moved when signaled, dissolving into terrain that had once felt confining. The enemy remained present, close enough to be dangerous, but the absence of predictable behavior worked in their favor. The commander moved last, checking each sector, ensuring that nothing essential had been overlooked. He felt the weight of the decision most acutely then, not as doubt, but as awareness of consequence. The order he had given would never appear dramatic in official histories. It would not read as defiance or sacrifice. It was, instead, an act of alignment, matching reality with responsibility. In choosing it, he accepted professional risk and personal burden alike. But as the unit slipped free of the tightening space, intact and disciplined, the logic of the decision affirmed itself not through success alone, but through the preservation of what mattered most. Survival, in this context, was not retreat. It was continuity. Movement carried consequences faster than thought. Once the first elements slipped beyond the perimeter, the terrain ceased to be neutral ground and became an active participant, shaping every step and sound. The enemy did not immediately react in force, and that absence mattered. It confirmed the commander's assessment that expectation had been disrupted. The opposing units, prepared for resistance or collapse, encountered neither. Instead, they faced ambiguity, and ambiguity slowed decision-making in ways no weapon could. For precious minutes, the balance tilted not through strength, but through misalignment. The men moved as trained, but training now served instinct rather than procedure. Boots found earth softened just enough to mute sound. Breathing slowed, synchronized unconsciously with the pace set ahead. Orders were passed by touch and proximity. Voices unnecessary. Equipment left behind felt heavier than what they carried, but there was no hesitation. Each man understood that weight, in this moment, was liability. Restraint governed everything, from the angle of a rifle to the urge to glance back. Forward motion became the only language. Enemy reaction arrived unevenly. A flare rose too late to illuminate the first groups, washing empty ground in pale light. Voices followed, sharp with urgency rather than certainty. Units shifted, but not yet in cohesion. They searched where doctrine told them to search, not where absence suggested movement. That delay, measured in minutes, translated into distance the Americans could not have gained under fire. The commander noted these reactions as he moved, absorbing confirmation that perception shaped action as decisively as numbers. Within the unit, response evolved from tension to focus. Fear did not disappear, but it narrowed, shedding excess thought. Men who had waited for days now acted with quiet precision, the fatigue of anticipation replaced by the clarity of purpose. Wounded soldiers were guided carefully. Pace adjusted without discussion. No one was left to fall behind unnoticed. The order to prioritize them was not debated. It was executed, reinforcing trust that had been built long before this night. As the enemy began to grasp what was happening, their movements grew louder, more hurried. Orders overlapped. Vehicles started and stopped. Fire was exchanged at the margins, brief and directional, more probing than decisive. The Americans did not answer unless required. Silence remained a weapon, denying the enemy confirmation. Each withheld shot preserved uncertainty, forcing pursuit to remain cautious. Numerical superiority meant little when its application lacked focus. Terrain continued to work in their favor. Narrow passages funneled pursuit into predictable lines, while the Americans dispersed just enough to avoid presenting targets. Timing proved critical. Movement occurred when enemy units were repositioning, their attention divided between control and reaction. The commander had anticipated this window not precisely, but accurately enough. He understood that large formations took time to reorient, and time, once lost, could not be reclaimed quickly. Confusion among the enemy peaked and then receded into a more deliberate response. By then, the distance achieved had altered the equation. The Americans were no longer contained within a shrinking space. They were transitioning through contested ground toward uncertainty that favored neither side equally. That equality mattered. It transformed pursuit from inevitability into risk. The enemy slowed, weighing the cost of aggressive advance against incomplete information. Caution replaced momentum. The immediate tactical outcome revealed itself incrementally. Groups regrouped at prearranged points, counts taken in whispers, adjustments made without ceremony. Losses were fewer than feared, though not absent. Each absence was felt sharply, but also contextualized. Survival was no longer theoretical. It had been enacted, imperfectly, but effectively. The commander assessed what remained of the unit's cohesion and found it intact, strained but functional. Perception shifted on both sides. What had appeared to the enemy as a force cornered and vulnerable now read as disciplined and elusive. That change carried weight beyond numbers. It suggested competence, planning, and intent, qualities that complicated pursuit. For the Americans, perception shifted inward. They no longer measured themselves solely against the enemy's strength, but against their own capacity to adapt. Confidence emerged not as bravado, but as steadiness. By dawn, the situation stabilized into a new reality. The enemy held ground that no longer contained its intended prize. The Americans occupied space that had not been planned, but had been earned. The balance of power had not reversed, but it had been recalibrated. Control replaced desperation. The commander recognized this not as victory, but as consequence properly managed. The decision he had made now unfolded fully, its logic validated not by ideology, but by outcome. Restraint had preserved options. Timing had multiplied effect. Perception had reshaped intent. None of these factors appeared dramatic in isolation, but together they altered the trajectory of events. What had once seemed inevitable defeat resolved into a controlled outcome that defied numerical logic precisely because it refused to engage it directly. The enemy's strength remained, but it had been rendered less relevant. As the unit continued onward, the weight of the night settled in different ways. Exhaustion returned, deeper now but accompanied by relief. The commander felt the consequences of his choice fully, not as vindication, but as responsibility carried forward. The war had not changed because of this decision, but lives had been preserved within it. That distinction mattered. It reaffirmed a truth often lost amid doctrine and scale. That command, at its core, was not about opposing force alone, but about shaping motion under pressure so that survival remained possible. The days that followed unfolded without urgency, marked instead by a slow return to structure. The unit reassembled fully only after distance and daylight allowed confirmation of what the night had obscured. Counts were taken carefully, names spoken aloud and answered, absences acknowledged without ceremony. Casualties were fewer than anticipated, though each carried weight disproportionate to number. Wounded men were evacuated through channels that felt almost surreal after isolation. The sound of engines and organized movement a reminder that the larger war had continued uninterrupted while this small fragment endured its own crisis. Reports were written in measured language. They described movements, timings, terrain, and enemy reaction without embellishment. The commander insisted on precision, not because it protected him, but because accuracy mattered more than narrative. Higher command responded days later with inquiries that reflected both relief and discomfort. The outcome had been favorable, yet the method challenged assumptions embedded in planning. There were questions about equipment abandoned, about deviations from established response models. Each was answered calmly, with reference to conditions on the ground rather than principle alone. Strategically, the episode altered little in maps or arrows. The front advanced elsewhere, objectives shifted, and larger formations absorbed attention. This position did not become a footnote of triumph or disaster. It remained marginal in scale, significant only to those who had occupied it. Yet within after-action evaluations, it surfaced repeatedly as an example of adaptive judgment. Analysts noted how restraint had limited enemy commitment, how timing exploited organizational inertia, how perception shaped pursuit more effectively than firepower. These observations were clinical, stripped of emotion, but they captured something doctrine alone could not. For the men, the impact was personal and enduring. Fatigue lingered, not merely physical, but mental. A residue of sustained tension released too quickly. Some spoke about the night in fragments, others not at all. What unified them was an unspoken understanding that survival had not been accidental. Trust in leadership deepened, not through rhetoric, but through demonstrated care. The knowledge that their lives had been weighed honestly altered how they carried themselves afterward, how they viewed orders, how they understood their own value within the machinery of war. The commander read the evaluations without defensiveness. He recognized the language, the careful balance between commendation and caution. His decision would not become doctrine. It resisted standardization. That was its strength and its limitation. He did not seek validation beyond clarity. In his own accounting, the choice had been neither bold nor conservative. It had been necessary. He accepted that others, in different circumstances, might have chosen differently. Judgment was not transferable in full. It depended on context, experience, and the willingness to accept responsibility without guarantee. Within the wider war, moments like this accumulated quietly. They did not alter outcomes alone, but they shaped how forces endured long enough to reach them. Leadership under extreme pressure rarely resembled the images later associated with command. It was not delivered through speeches or decisive gestures, but through sustained attention, the ability to absorb uncertainty, and the discipline to act without spectacle. This episode revealed that truth plainly. It showed how survival itself could be an objective when weighed against marginal gain. Post-war analyses would later revisit similar situations, extracting principles while acknowledging exceptions. They would note how numerical superiority failed to translate into control when expectation was disrupted, how smaller units preserved agency through restraint and timing. These lessons would be taught cautiously, framed as considerations rather than prescriptions. The danger of mythologizing such decisions lay in misunderstanding their fragility. Success here had not been guaranteed. It had been possible. For the commander, memory of the episode did not fade, but it settled. He recalled it not as a defining moment, but as a convergence of many smaller ones. The tracks in frozen soil, the silence on the radio, the weight of a map that no longer matched reality. He remembered faces more than movements, voices more than orders. What stayed with him was the quiet after the decision, the sense of alignment between responsibility and action that came rarely and briefly. The war moved on. The unit was reassigned, absorbed into larger operations where individual judgment mattered less visibly. Some men carried the experience into later engagements, others carried it home. It surfaced in how they reacted to uncertainty, how they measured risk, how they understood authority. The episode did not grant immunity from fear or loss, but it offered a reference point, a reminder that outcomes were shaped as much by what was avoided as by what was confronted. History often favors drama, but endurance is built on quieter foundations. This story endures not because it featured overwhelming odds or decisive battles, but because it exposed the discipline required to choose survival when expectation demanded sacrifice. It demonstrated that leadership was not the assertion of will against reality, but the alignment of action with it. In that alignment, lives were preserved, cohesion maintained, and the war continued with one less unnecessary loss. The significance of such moments lies not in their visibility, but in their accumulation. They form the connective tissue between campaigns, the unseen decisions that allow larger strategies to function. This episode stands as one of those moments, modest in scale, profound in implication. It reminds us that command judgment is measured not by how closely it follows doctrine, but by how honestly it engages circumstance. In choosing survival over expectation, the commander did not defy the war. He understood it.